Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This video is my review and comparison of both texts of Book 12 in the iconic and classic Hardy Boys series, which of course is Footprints Under the Window. Now, by two texts, I mean the original 1933 text by series creator Leslie McFarlane, and then the revised text of the same name written in 1965 and done by David Grams. For those who are unaware, and just to give a brief overview of what I mean by revision process, starting in 1959, the Stratemeyer Syndicate decided it was time to revamp and rework the pre-existing books dating back to 1927's The Tower Treasure, which was the first book. And this meant over a roughly almost 20-year period of time, the Syndicate had different people come in and rework the books to be technically more modern. That was the overall idea, and the gist of it was to remove dated references. The big thing they would highlight, of course, are the dated usage of some racial and ethnic stereotyping. In particular, you do see that here in Footprints Under the Window, so it is understandable why they would want to address those certain elements. However, those elements didn't always occur in the books. In fact, it's really more specific books like Footprints that it played more of a part. But while that is a rather a good idea and something that is a positive move forward and something that makes sense, they also seemingly did this revision process as a means to significantly cut down the page count and also remove a lot of the shades of gray that McFarlane in particular put into his stories, and that he made his characters feel more well-rounded and dimensionalized. And you had the boys and other youth characters in the books and their friends and chums have a sort of healthy, not disrespect, but a healthy sense of questioning authority figures and adults. And of course, having two boy detectives, you need them to be able to question things. There's also, certainly a sort of pulpy flavor to the original Hardy Boys text, and the level of danger is much more felt and much increased actually in the original text. There is certainly a flavor of a sort of sanitization of the books in the revised text process, and that seems to be part of the mandate the Syndicate had. So each writer approached things differently, and that meant that you had the original books be slowly replaced over time, in and out of order, over, again, an almost 20-year period, and they didn't tell anybody they were doing this. So quickly, the revised text would replace the originals one by one, and they vary to such a degree that in the extreme case, the only connection they have to the original text is the title, and the book can be entirely different. Most of them do have echoes or certain elements of the original text in them, but sometimes they can get so transmogrified and moved around, or are just bare passing mentions that only if you read the text back to back can you get that's a fleeting glimpse of the original. But then others are only slight revisions, or they add a subplot, or they make the original plot the subplot of the new story that's being told. It's a very particular example of literary revisionism, and there's not really anything else quite like this. The Syndicate also did this for the Nancy Drew books. So all the books up to 1959, so for the Hardy Boys, the first 38, you have to also track down the original text editions from before the point the revised text took over. Now, Footprints Under the Window, as I mentioned, is one of, well, there's really two books in particular that most fans or Hardy Boys nerds are aware of, or will be able to point to as the ones that are the most obvious in terms of having examples of cultural and racial stereotyping, which of course was very common in pop culture at the time, and especially in printed literature. This is still the era of the pulp magazines, and you do have to keep in mind we are talking about a book from 1933. If you've ever read any sort of material, especially any pulp stories, adventure stories, anything from the era of the pulp magazine, and it at all has anything to do with particularly the Chinese community, or is set in perhaps Chinatown, or maybe actually set in China itself, or somewhere in the Far East. Anything that is dealing with Asian cultures is going to have a particular kind of stereotyping for the most part. And it's pretty much part and parcel anytime you have any sort of really any sort of Asian character in most stories of this era. So to go in knowing that the original text is dealing with not only a corrupt Chinese laundry that's being used as a front, but also dealing with Chinatown and gangs and tongs, and also dogfights, and ultimately the plot of both books does heavily involve the smuggling of immigrants into the country illegally, and essentially is getting into human trafficking and these poor souls being essentially forced into indentured servitude. You know that you're going to obviously see in a 1933 book that is set in these areas and in this part of town and dealing with these themes, you are going to see some cultural stereotyping. You are going to see some Chinese characters who do speak in a particular depiction of someone who English is obviously not their first language. So it obviously is going to be extremely dated in that way. However, since I've now read a lot of other various pulp materials and other stories, I've gotten a greater experience of just how bad that could get, or how insensitive materials could get about things like that. And unfortunately, this not only was it a popular topic among pulp writers at the time, people didn't really think about how this would make other people feel. It is obviously a product of its times and should be understood in that way. So it makes sense why the syndicate would specifically target or look at certain books of the original Hardy Boys texts and the original Nancy Drew texts as well, that this was much more of an obvious factor and would very much stand out and be considered offensive to readers decades later. With that being said, every time I come back to the original text of Footprints Under the Window, I have to say it is by no means, in terms of the stereotyping on display, it's by no means as horribly bad or offensive as some other pulp stories of the era could be. It's definitely present with characters the boys encounter. But it's not a book that is trying to be offensive, I don't think. It doesn't have that air to it. It seems more just a product of its time and people not really thinking about how that stereotyping was unfortunately so ingrained in our culture, especially in the 1930s. So it feels very much like the sort of setting you would have in any sort of pulp story that is, say, perhaps, for example, set in a city's Chinatown district. So it's not out of place for a 1930s pulp story, but it is. This is one of the few books where this really is a prevalent factor when you're reading the original text. And so I think it's one of those where you should kind of know going in if that really does bother you. This is a factor here. However, again, it's not done in a way to really be derogatory, I don't think. There's also, interestingly, and I should point out that there is a character who is a longtime resident of the town of Bayport, where the Hardy Boys live, that did run the laundry that's now been taken over by seemingly nefarious forces. And he is a longstanding resident who has, tried to become a great positive American citizen and tried to master the English language, and does not speak with the sort of stereotypical dialect of characters of Asian origin who speak a sort of again, the sort of stereotypical English that's sort of broken in places. So he is presented as a character of Asian origin who is not a caricature. So there is at least one non-stereotypical Asian character here in the book, even though the rest are obviously in keeping with what you'd see in a lot of pulp literature. So I did want to make that distinction because I sort of forget about it every time until I come back and read the book again. So, of course, these elements were pretty much completely removed from the revised text. However, again, even though I wanted to sort of start this with that disclaimer, because this is one of the two books in particular of the original text where this is most prevalent and going to be at its most obvious as an issue. Obviously, it's just trying to tell an adventure story, and it just uses Chinatown and gangs and human trafficking and as sort of the atmosphere and the world it's moving around in. But because it was written and published in 1933, when anytime you had a story even remotely near a Chinatown district, it was most obviously going to have quite a number of stereotypes and caricatures and things. So this is obviously a product of its time, and I think that's quite obvious when you read it. You can very much tell this is a 1930s story. The main thrust of the plot is actually pretty much the same in both. This is a book that some fan sites claim is completely different, but in reality, what they did in the revised text is to add a secondary plot and make that more of the primary focus, but still keeping the main plot of the original book as a sort of background in ways, while also keeping its structure for most of the book. Now, in both books, our lead detectives of Frank and Joe Hardy are essentially on their own for a bit. Their father, world-renowned private investigator Fenton Hardy, is off on some sort of secret case, and the boys don't really know where he is. In both texts, they have to deal with their famously peppery Aunt Gertrude coming to town, and they find themselves entangled in a mystery that has at least something to do with various mysterious individuals, including one who they encounter many times, and they only know by the identifying footprints that are left. And the first time they discover this are when they discover this figure has been a sort of prowler outside the Hardy home and left his footprints under the window, which gives us the title. In the original text, the boys are essentially dealing with what becomes it's really dealing with a smuggling ring, and their primary cargo, if you want to call it that, unfortunately, is actually they are human traffickers, and they are it's essentially a gang tied to various tongs and other criminal organizations, and they are smuggling in mostly Chinese, but other illegal immigrants who they then blackmail and force into indentured servitude. They do this by also utilizing a laundry that they've taken over, and they use it as sort of a front. It is very much a pulpy story in its flavor. It is very well executed, and again, the sense of danger overall, like all of the McFarlane written original text, is much more prevalent, as is the world building and the sense of the world of the story being much more lived in and much more felt, right down to the descriptive terms. Even the sort of manner of how the story gets started and the plot structure is not only more detailed, it's more thought out and actually has a bit more of a danger element. When Aunt Gertrude is arriving in Bayport, the boys go to a ship to meet her, and she's not on it. They wind up meeting another individual who's for some reason trying to get in touch with Fenton Hardy, and so the boys bring him home. And then not only does this man mysteriously disappear, but also so does some of Fenton Hardy's important secret documents pertaining to some of his various cases. If that were not enough, not only does Aunt Gertrude finally show up and recalls meeting a mysterious individual on the boat, but it's also quickly revealed that she's feeling quite sick because she was actually seemingly poisoned by this mysterious individual, and they actually have to go and get a doctor, and she has to be under nursing care because she actually does potentially almost die. And the boys also then have to try and figure out who and why was she poisoned on her sort of vacation cruise. And if that were not enough, in the intervening time at the same dock where the boys were, there was an entire brawl that broke out between various Chinese factions in town, and it's very obvious this must have been instigated by the criminal elements that the boys start to uncover, and this had to be broken up by the police, and it got quite bloody and things. None of this happens in the revised text, but you have the same sort of structure. In the revised text, the boys have to meet Aunt Gertrude, and she is delayed, but she is not actually almost poisoned to death, so that sort of worry factor isn't there. Nor do we have the whole sort of dock fight between all of these people, where some people get bloodied up or even killed or taken to hospital and under police protection and police guard and things. But we also have a subplot in the revised text, which kind of really becomes the main plot. It's sort of typical for the boys to get somehow involved with a government project or some sort of facility or company that's working on a top secret project that, of course, turns out to be some sort of government project. And that happens here with the Micro Eye facility. That's the company name. And they're working on some sort of very hush-hush project, and they're having to deal with saboteurs trying to steal or destroy this project. So the boy's father, Fenton Hardy, is sort of loosely, has sort of been loosely working on this case, but of course they don't really know where he is and what he's working on. But it seems perhaps that he may be working on this case incognito. The boys are then sort of brought in to the Micro Eye case when they themselves happen to stumble across a would-be saboteur trying to break into the facility. And this becomes the main sort of A plot, if you will, of the revised text, is the boys trying to find and stop the gang who is out to sabotage Micro Eye. And not only do we have the same opening setup of Aunt Gertrude coming to town, an individual stealing away from the boys' house at night, the papers of their father mysteriously disappearing, and there being a sign of an intruder outside with the footprints under the window, but also the gang the boys are investigating in a touch that's it's probably a bit much. It definitely kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. But I guess for some reason it was decided that the title Footprints Under the Window had to tie into the book another way. So the gang the boys are trying to unmask and stop are actually also apparently a named footprint. So they are not only trying to figure out the individual who they keep running into and not seeing, who leaves footprints everywhere, but the actual gang of saboteurs is actually the Footprints gang. So it's not often that you see that happen, where they add a whole second meaning of the title, but it does happen sometimes in the revised text. It just kind of makes me chuckle that they felt the need to also name the gang of saboteurs the Footprints gang. The structure, again, of the original text does, for the most part, remain here in the revised text. So I wouldn't call this an example of a revision that is completely different from the original text, because especially when you read these back to back, you can definitely tell the same events happen, or the same events are echoed. For example, seeing the character Aunt Gertrude ran into on the boat actually in Bayport, and then that perhaps he has a sort of doppelganger. There is also a sort of third-party character, a sort of duplicitous, untrustworthy, I guess, sort of local shipping magnate, if you will, named Orrin North, who may or may not be involved with the gang the boys are after in both texts, and who does actually seek out the boys' assistance, and also claims to have been working with their father. So there's a bit of sort of back and forth between North and the boys in both texts, and in both texts he seems, a very suspicious character. So again, that's another reason why I really hesitate. I wouldn't call this a revision where everything has changed, because we even have the same character playing the same role in both texts. And again, the structure is pretty similar for most of the revised text. Where we go into uncharted territory is really in the, well, I guess it would technically be the last third of the revised text. And that's what's alluded to on the final cover artwork, because the boys actually do manage to track down members of the organization. And it seems that they have been utilizing unwilling patsies to carry back and forth stolen information and material about the Micro Eye project to another country. And this is another country that is ruled by a dictator not friendly to the United States. So it seems like a very, I mean, it's kind of like a very thinly disguised attempt at sending the Hardy Boys to Cuba or any other South American or Latin American nation at the time that was not necessarily U.S. friendly. And it's an interesting sort of setup. And this is, of course, 1965, still in the midst of the Cold War. So it is an interesting idea to send the boys down south to another country and to really get them out of their element. And this does actually really work. The unfortunate part is it's sort of just tacked into the third and final act of the book, and because the revised texts have a shorter page count, the boys kind of just wander around and kind of magically run into the people they need to run into and turn up information and then go back to Bayport. So it's almost like a sort of, I mean, it's not a detour, but it doesn't feel fully fleshed out. But I do really applaud the effort to send the boys to a different location to get them out of their comfort zone. And it does add quite a bit of nice flavor that feels unique. So it does add a good amount of spice to the reading experience, and it does help to distinguish this from the original text. And then the final climax of both books is completely different, but of course does revolve around the final battle with the gang and trying to bring the case to a close. So even though they are completely different, the overall idea is the same. David Grams does an excellent job with the revised text. He really has a handle on the characters, and as you're reading through the revised text, you can always tell when the ghostwriter of that book, because of course all the books were ghostwritten, you can tell when certain writers came back who had a real handle on the characters as compared to some of the revised texts that feel, I mean, they feel a little bit more generic. Some are really get swept up in the action focus the revised text had, where it was all about moving the plot quickly, cramming in as many action beats as you could, and keeping that pace up. And also the page count was shorter, so you had less number of pages to actually tell your story. So your pace did have to be faster. But Grams really understands these characters. He writes them well, so this is one of the revised texts that does have at least some amount of the world building and lived-in quality of the McFarlane original text. It's not as much, but it does have some of that, and that's really appreciated because not every revised text had that. I think this also makes perfect sense because Grams wrote what I think is one of the best revised texts in the Shore Road Mystery. He wrote that revised text of Book 6, which I think is an exceptional example of a great revised text that builds upon its original brother version. However, as much as I enjoy reading this revised text, again, the sort of third act that goes into another country, you know, it kind of feels like a different book in ways. It's tied into the plot, but it does feel definitely removed from the rest of the story that takes place in Bayport. And as much as I think Grams did have a handle on the characters and does retain some of that lived-in feeling, it's still not Leslie McFarlane. The original text is very pulpy. It is very much a boy's own thrilling adventure for younger boys, written and set in the 1930s. It is very much of its era, but it's also charming and gleeful and much more tightly plotted as well. The plot actually hangs together extremely well, and it's a better plot than the revised text. I think had the revised text been able to be a longer book and flesh out some of those new ideas and make all the new material mesh better with the original material that they had to keep in there as the sort of holdover to still be able to call it Footprints Under the Window, I think that would have helped the revised text be better. But you can definitely tell the original text is more consistent throughout. It's also, again, you can't deny that pulp adventure factor because there is a greater sense of danger. The action, while the revised text technically has more action, it doesn't get as gritty as the original text. I mean, the boys even find themselves attacked by a ferocious dog out of nowhere, not once, but twice. And as I talk about all the McFarlane books, the sense of humor, the sense of that wonderful lived-in quality, the banter the boys have between their friends, and even how the other characters are written, how Aunt Gertrude is, obviously a very difficult person to live with or be around. She's much more detailed and fleshed out and feels like a real person you actually know. And the fact that the danger factor is greatly increased and the sense of the passage of time is better felt. And it really underlines how the revised text lost something by not only having to abide by what the syndicate wanted, but also having to have a significantly shorter page count because the revised texts are all 160 to 175 pages tops, whereas the original texts are almost always over 200 pages, usually between 200 to 215. Doesn't sound like a lot at first, but it definitely means a writer can find their tone and stick to it. The humor here is, as I always like to talk about in the McFarlane books, is really rewarding. You read the McFarlane text and you do actually laugh out loud. There are great chuckles throughout, and it's nice to have the boys be a bit, maybe a little bit cynical here and there. They have a better sense of the world around them, and it doesn't feel kind of sanitized like the revised texts do, where all authorities are perfect and know everything, and the boys are working alongside FBI agents and the chief of police and stuff, and everything is perfectly fine. Whereas in the original text, there's still an air of distrust, and the boys are sort of mocked by adults and things, and they have to prove themselves. But in this book, there's a particular aspect that is probably one of the most notable elements of sheer oddness that's kind of unexpected, but it's such a bizarre idea how they immediately jump to this, that every time I read this book, I can't help but think this is just kind of wild. So in the original text, the boys actually have to locate essentially a witness who is fearing for his life. He is a Chinese character who has sort of escaped the clutches of the gang, and they manage to actually track him down, but then they realize very quickly that they'll have to hide him somewhere, and they have to keep him under wraps, otherwise he will most obviously be eliminated. They also very narrowly escape an assassination attempt, so they know the threat is real, and they know they're being watched. So, this isn't really giving anything away because Joe Hardy just kind of randomly comes up with it. But the means of getting this character safely to their house where they can hide him away, they essentially go inside this restaurant and borrow a bunch of clothes, and they have this unfortunate witness character who is Chinese, and obviously English is not his first language, but he's very much out of his element now because essentially they put him in drag. So they then drive the witness dressed in women's clothing and everything back to their house, and then hide him away in their attic, in the same house, mind you, where their aunt is recovering and has a 24-hour nurse. So if he's discovered, they're going to freak out. And of course, if the villains discover the Hardys have hidden the witness there, they're going to come in and obviously try to kill him and everyone else. But the humor doesn't stop there, because not only is the witness extremely uncomfortable and complaining bitterly about where he's found himself in life, but the fact that the Hardys' friends and their girlfriends have seen them driving around town with a, quote, pretty girl, or a pretty mystery girl. They, of course, want to know who this mysterious character is, and the boys can't let on and won't let on, and that leads to all kinds of embarrassment for them. And then they also, again, have to worry about keeping this informant alive and keeping him hidden away in their attic, and, how do they get him food and meals and keep him from getting discovered and things. And again, anytime they have to go out or reconnoiter and try to discover more of the villain's plot, and if they have to bring the informant with them, of course he's in drag again. It's just, every time I read the original text, I can't help it. It really gets to me. It's such a sort of, oddball, slightly goofy concept. Of course, it's been done many, many times, but it's done very matter-of-factly here, and I like the fact that it inadvertently causes other issues for the boys that they have to figure out some flimsy explanation for. So, again, while it is a character who is obviously speaking in a very much caricatured, broken English of sorts, it's not. It's seemingly not meant to be harmful or offensive or necessarily demeaning to that character. It's just a completely wacky scenario that everyone finds themselves in. And I just find it kind of funny how Joe Hardy randomly thinks, oh yeah, we'll just dress him in women's clothes, that'll work. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. But that is the funniest part of this whole book, and it's very much unexpected. But that is the type of complete whimsy you can get in a Leslie McFarlane original Hardy Boys text from time to time. Usually he has a bit of whimsy throughout each of the books, and you encounter all kinds of different off-the-wall characters who, again, help to further enrich the world of the story. But this is just one of those. Every time I reread this book, I can't help it. It gets to me, just the inherent silliness of the whole scenario, and then they have to carry on this charade for the rest of the book. The idea of dressing yourself in a disguise does also come into play at the end of the book, when the boys are sort of preparing their final assault, which does actually feel more dangerous than what you get in the revised text, because the threat is much more looming and omnipresent throughout the whole book. But we do actually have Frank Hardy assume a sort of disguise. He tries to disguise himself to look more Chinese in terms of having of wearing certain clothing and things. It doesn't really go anywhere because they are caught and discovered pretty quickly, but that's also something you'll see that seems pretty common in a lot of 1930s pulp stories, where you're going into, say, for example, the Chinatown section of a city, and you may have your hero character try to assume a disguise. Again, not necessarily something that you do nowadays, because it's not only an old-fashioned idea, but it can be obviously, insensitive to have a character, disguise themselves right down to putting makeup on and things. It makes sense within the story. It's a very small element, but of course it's another element that the revision process really, sort of focused in on and was like, okay, yeah, that goes out too. And again, that's understandable. It's not a major thing. It's not necessarily bad. It's not done in a bad way, but it's just another example that this is obviously a book that they were going to revise sooner rather than later, and I'm just amazed they waited until 1965. But the original text, again, it's not. While this is a factor throughout, it's not a book where it's seemingly designed to be offensive in that way. It's just, it feels when you read it very much of its time where people simply didn't think about these things. And any sort of pulp fiction with any of these themes or locations or characters, you're going to see some form of this. And thankfully, this is on more of the lesser side of, I guess if there was a sort of offensiveness meter. It's not as, it's obviously nowhere near as bad as that could get with other similar materials at this time period. But it should be stressed, you can very much tell when you start reading the original text that it is a book written and published in 1933 in the pulp era. So overall, I do think the original text is the better book. I think it is more consistent. I think the tone is more consistent. And once again, it's really an unfair comparison to stack a revised text done years later up against an original Leslie McFarlane book, who of course wrote the majority of the original 26 books. Actually, he wrote almost all of them with a few exceptions. And he is the one who really set the tone, defined the characters, and had the best sense of who they were and the world they lived in. And that's why his books are the ones that stand the test of time the most. And anytime you're going up against really the creator of a series and the primary writer, again, it's an unfair comparison. So I think it was great that they got David Grams to write more revised text, and I think it's a very strong text revision. But it does show that it is from the mid-'60s, and by this point they were really trying to cram in more popular elements of the 60s. There is obviously a James Bond and spycraft influence because the spy craze of the 60s was in full swing in 1965, so that influence is felt here. You also have more of a sense of globetrotting, and the boys can seemingly do all kinds of things that in reality most boys would probably never be given the opportunity to do so. I give Grams a lot of credit for coming up with some nice sequences, and the final sort of battle and end sequence actually rather nicely takes place mostly in a cemetery, with the boys actually going into a vault or crypt, which is nicely done. So even though I think the revised text isn't as good as the original text, it is a very good example of a revised text, and it does maintain at least the gist of the same plot, and it does add significant amounts of new material. I just don't think that new material was able to be fleshed out as much as it really needed to, but that's kind of part of how these revisions go, because you have to look at the constraints these writers were under. So I think the revised text is very good, but I do think the original text, it's just more consistent. And again, you can't discredit that pulp adventure flavor and that consistent sense that the danger is greater. And because the plot is tighter, because they don't go to another country in the last act of the book, the story feels more focused. We don't have an entire other subplot about a secret government project being sabotaged, so we're not distracted from the main plot. And we don't have a sort of watering down of the plot structure, which we do in the revised text. They sort of take the spine of the first half in terms of structure and rework it a little bit and definitely turn down the danger factor. And of course, if that were not enough, in the original text, you have the Hardy Boys hide a witness who is possibly going to be killed by the gang that's after him by putting him in drag and hiding him in their attic. So, yeah. You don't get that in the revised text. So now to talk briefly about the various cover artworks, as I like to do in these videos. The original 1933 cover was by J. Clemens Greder, just like the previous book. And it also carries that similar sort of, it's obviously also by the sea again. Here we have the dock. We have the large, looming, almost malevolent sense of the sky being an orangish red. We have the sort of setting sun being really ominous. And this is, again, exactly like While the Clock Ticked that Greder did. So they basically kept the same exact style, and it's very dramatic looking with the orange and sort of blue purples. And we have the boys onlooking as the gang is about to basically essentially commit murder. So we have a nice sense of action. We have nice dynamic visual, and it's really attention grabbing. And of course, it is depicting an event from the book. So I think this is an exceptionally strong cover. I think it's really a shame that Gritter didn't do more covers at this time, because they are a little simplistic in ways, which kind of fits with the covers of the first 10 books. But while it carries on that tradition, they are so much more dynamic and so much more attention grabbing and have bold color usage. So I have to say, I really love these covers that he did for 11 and 12, especially because of the ominous feeling they give with the setting sun and orange, dark, almost reddish orange sky in the background. And there just being a palpable sense of danger on them. And then we come to the 1950 second cover by Bill Gillies. And all of those factors I mentioned are gone. And this is pretty common. If it's on all the covers that Gillies did. Every cover he did for a Hardy Boys book is, nicely detailed enough, at least has some visual layout to it that's at least, somewhat pleasing to the eye, but they also have such a feeling of plainness to them. I like that we're actually getting the title in here because we actually have footprints under a window, and we have a character in the window, and we have the boys essentially spying on him, and there's the dock in the background. But, this is nowhere near as dramatic as the Gritter cover of the first edition. So that, and also there's such a sense of wasted space here. The title is sort of scrunched over to the side, but then also you've got the starry sky, and you've got the dock and everything, but it just feels like it's almost like a photograph that's off angle a bit. And I always kind of feel that way about Gillies' art designs. So I do think this is nicely detailed, and I like the color. I like that he has the starry night sky in there. There is a slight feeling of danger that the boys might be discovered, but it's very slight. I do think this is one of the better Gillies covers, but I still think it's a major downgrade, and it's too plain, really. And so of the covers, this one's definitely the plainest, so I think this one is actually the least of the three main covers. Because then we come to the revised text cover done in 1965 by legendary and main later series artist Rudy Nappy. This is, of course, giving us a revised text exclusive scene, and the boys are in actual peril in another country, and it looks like they're about to be discovered by an entire armed band of rebels, complete with shotguns and machetes in hand, and there's no way out. And we've even got the working in of the footprints under the window. So there's a lot going on in this cover. It's really well done. The layout is quite nice because the visual staging of this actually underlines that the boys are actually being discovered. They're not about to be discovered. They are literally in the process of being discovered. They're in plain sight. They're obviously starting to freak out. And we actually have, the Hardy Boys and Chet Morton in detail. We can make out who is who. And when you read the book, you actually can recognize which event is being depicted, because this is an event from the book, and it's really the highlight of the sort of third final act sequence in another country. So I think this is a great cover, but it is, of course, dealing with the revised text only. So I can't necessarily call it the best cover for Footprints Under the Window because it is revised text specific, and sometimes this happens because a lot of the revised text covers are only dealing with events from the revised text. So for this particular example, I think the original Gritter cover is the best cover of the original text, and obviously the Nappy cover artwork is perfect for the revised text. Now, I will mention, since I have one of these, I've not gone over the British artworks, which are usually very different from the American ones, because the British versions had their own publishing order. They mixed and matched the original and revised texts and things. But I do actually have the British edition, and this one, it is very similar and in keeping with the artwork of all of the initial published versions of the Hardy Boys in the UK. They sort of mimicked the hardcover design with dust jacket of the editions, particularly in the 1940s era with the yellow spines. It seems like that's what they were using as their sort of model. However, they all had their own unique identifiers, and all the covers of this era for the dust jackets have a sort of have a very colorful approach, but also almost a slight edge of cartooniness, if you will. They are always depicting an action moment or event from the book, but you can definitely tell there's a slight lesser degree of reality to them. But this one, for Footprints, I think is really well done. I think it's one of the most realistic looking of the British covers I've seen. The bold color really pops off the jacket and very much fits with this being a very pulpy story. So this one is honestly just as pulpy looking as the original Greta US cover, but this one is just going for, full tilt depicting action. And this is from the end of the book where Frank's not very good Chinese disguise is obviously uncovered, and you get the danger factor of the story right on the cover because he's been unmasked and captured by an entire gang and is essentially about to be thrown down a trap door, and it looks like he's about to be murdered, which of course he is in the story. So I think this is one of the best British covers, and honestly, it's a great cover for the book, and they could have used it here in the States, but, obviously it is underlining the fact that there are a lot of Chinese characters in this book. It is set in the city's Chinatown district, and there is obviously some cultural stereotyping for sure in this book. So this is the cover that very much puts all of that on the front. So it very much is the most indicative of what the book is, because you're getting a full moment from the book without any sort of artistic flair on it. This is very much a more typical sort of pulp magazine cover. If this story was published in a pulp magazine and they made it the cover, you could picture this British artwork as the cover of this story if it had been published as a pulp magazine. So to then briefly talk about the editions I have, we'll start with this British version, which again, you can really look at the beautiful color when you get to see a physical example. But all of the British covers at this time really went for bold color. And you can see how they used elements of the books in the US. We even have a version of the yellow spine, but with its own unique identifiers and logo. And then really interestingly, the books at this time in the UK would give little sort of comic strip versions of the next book. So you could look at the back and actually get a little sort of mini comic advertisement for the next book to really entice you to read and buy and purchase the next book. And I really love this touch. They never did this on any of the American editions. The other really unique element where they took the US book, kept the design, but did their own thing with it. We do have the iconic Hardy Boys design with the logo, but it's not brown tweed. Here, the UK edition is orange, and all the text is in black with the iconic Hardy Boys logo. So this is the biggest signifier that this is not an American edition, and I really like that this is bold orange. It's very different from the US brown and tweed that we're used to, and is part of just some of the many interesting and odd variations of collecting the UK editions. Then we open to see the iconic orange Greta in papers. The revised front piece art done by A.O. Scott in the 1940s was copied for this release. And then we get to the text block, which of course is the original text, but the UK edition did seemingly reset it a little bit. So the actual text block throughout and the chapter headings are a little bit different. So that's another sort of unique signifier that you've got a British edition. Now we come to my hardcover with dust jacket edition. This has the Gillies artwork. This is in really nice shape. It's very difficult, of course, nowadays to find any of the hardcovers with intact dust jackets, because the dust jackets were the first thing to go and the hardest thing to preserve. So this is one of my nicer ones. This is a 1950s printing because on the inside It lists to Yellow Feather Mystery, which came out in 1953. So this dates to about 1953. We have the Orange Greta In Papers. And we have the iconic brown tweed of the actual hardcover itself. Again, the revised front piece artwork. And you can see what the actual text block of the original text is supposed to look like. And the rear has a plug for the Rick Brandt Science Adventure Stories, also from the Straight and Matter Syndicate. And then my copy of the revised text is my childhood flashlight edition. So here we have the nappy artwork. It's transferred pretty well. I've always noticed that the flashlight editions of this, it's one of those where the artwork, when they scanned it, it just comes across as quite a bit contrastier. I've looked at original or picture cover copies, and those always seem to have a bit more color depth to them, but I've just never found one that was in good enough shape to add to my collection, which I'd like to do sometime. But you'll always notice the flashlight editions vary in how well they reproduce the art. This is just one where I've always noticed that it just seemed sort of more contrasty, a little bit milkier in the background details and things, but it still looks pretty good. And of course, while they did have to do some cropping and resizing, they did do it well, and that's not something that stayed that way. So as I always say, the earlier flashlight editions from before 2005 are always better made and better put together than all of the more modern printings of the flashlight editions. Of course, we have the matching flashlight spine, which is identical on all of these, and the identical rear generic cover. Of course, we have the modernized listing and the book blurb for the revised text. Here is the new front piece artwork with the finale taking place in the cemetery and the wonderful spooky bit of the tomb door opening. This is a printing from 1999, so of course that means I've had this for 24 years and I feel old. But again, especially if you have a good condition flashlight copy from before 2000, that's when they were really made well. So, I've had this all these years and it's still really well put together. It's not that the later printings are bad, but you can definitely tell they just feel a little bit more sloppy in areas, and some the cover art isn't done right, or various things happen, but they seem to have not been made with as much care as they went on in reprintings over the years. And then we have the revised text block. And then to go over the revised text exclusive images, I like how the revised text even worked in a return of everyone's favorite amateur, bumbling, annoying detective, Oscar Smuff. So again, that's another sign that David Graham's had a much better handle on the Hardy's world than other revised text writers. Here we get one of the much more infrequent two-page spread images. So overall, I think that both texts of Footprints Under the Window remain excellent reads even to this day. However, I do think the revised text, while it does nicely have an entire new plot and a good sense of the characters and the world, it is still kind of watering down the original story, which is sort of made the B subplot of the secondary to the A plot of the secret government project that the Micro Eye facility is working on. And the final act that has the boys go out of the country and then come back at the very end does feel a little bit out of place because there's just not enough time or page count to develop that further. Essentially, the revised text has a lot of the pluses and minuses of all the text revisions and underlines some of the inherent issues that the syndicate caused in their sort of mandated process of making the revised text. But thankfully, we had a really great writer who knew the characters and cared about getting that sense across to the reader. So it's still a very effective revised text that is very well done and better than the sort of more average ones. However, it's not as good as the original text. The original text is more consistent in tone, has a greater sense of reality and the world of the characters. The characters are more three-dimensional. The humor is so much more varied and genuine. The sense of danger is much more palpable. And the original text is a pulp-fused adventure for boys. It is a 1930s pulp adventure. It's one of the original texts that is most obviously a pulp type of adventure. It is, of course, also, however, dated in terms of the cultural stereotyping that you do see on display. That is a definite factor in this volume, and it does make it one that is more objectionable for those elements. It's really one of two, the other being the Hidden Harbor mystery, where the cultural stereotyping is much more prevalent and a major part of the book, because we are talking about major characters and they're not sort of random acquaintances that the boys may pass and in fleeting other moments of other books. So that is an element that should be discussed and looked at and addressed, and it makes sense why they did revise these two particular books for those reasons. But again, the whole revision process was also about other things. It wasn't just about changing and removing the dated elements. So while they could say that's why they were doing it, it's also pretty obvious they were doing it for other reasons too. So in revising the text, it makes sense to remove the dated aspects, obviously, because they were part of another time where unfortunately people just didn't consider how offensive that could be to other people. But in doing all of that, as well done as the revised text is, and as much new material that is there, it does feel otherwise like a watered down version of the original text, and it's just not as consistently plotted, and it just doesn't feel as effective overall, especially when you read them back to back. If you read the revised text by itself, it would seem perfectly fine, but when you read it directly compared to the original text, it just does not hold up as much. So you do have to go into the original text knowing that you are going to see obviously some cultural stereotyping, because this is, again, a 1933 book. However, it never has the feeling that it was intended to be offensive. The point of the book is to tell a pulp adventure story for boys, and it is merely using these characters and this setting as something to make this book a bit different. It achieves this, but you do have to understand that you are going to run into the very dated cultural stereotyping, and if you've read any 1930s pulp material with any of these elements, you know that is in pretty much every 1930s pulp story that deals with those things. So it's not going to be a foreign concept, essentially, if you know anything about 1930s adventure stories that dealt with, say, for example, Chinese characters. You are going to see some cultural stereotyping. So the original text is very much dated in that regard. But outside of that, it is the better book, it is the better written book, it is the more consistent book, and it's the better adventure. And of the early, really the first 20 original Hardy Boys texts, it is one of the most straightforward pulp adventure mysteries that the Hardy Boys ever got themselves involved in. And again, it's kind of an unfair comparison when you have the revised text going up against the primary series creator and writer and Leslie McFarlane. It's not a fair comparison. So both books are excellent. Both books should be read and enjoyed by Hardy Boys fans everywhere. But when you read them and do comparisons, the original text absolutely comes out on top. So I do hope my thoughts and recollections and comparisons of both texts of Book 12 and the classic Hardy Boys series, Footprints Under the Window, have been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you have any comments or memories or are doing a similar comparison reread on your own, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I hope to return soon with my comparison and thoughts on Book 13, The Mark on the Door. And as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some wonderful Hardy Boys editions for your collection. Please do keep reading and enjoying the iconic Hardy Boys series. They are timeless. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.